everyone, welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast, episode 71, which is kind of crazy. I'm Cullen McFader, and as always, joined by Clark Coffey.
Hey, what's going on, dude?
Not much. I'm really excited to talk about this one today.
Me too.
Because this is a really very, a movie with lots of meat to it. I think
Boy, doesn't it ever. Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Have a lot.
In case you hadn't read the title, of course, what we're talking about today is Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. That's right.
Yep. Yes, we are. And that was my pick.
That was my pick. Yeah, Clark's pick.
And you know what? It's kind of crazy. Like I was, watching this again for the first time in a long time, and kind of wrapping my head around the context of its original release and everything. Mm-hmm. When I picked this film, I just completely and totally forgot, or didn't even think of, I guess might even be a better way to say it, like all of the kind of the controversy and everything that was surrounding this film at the time of its release. I completely forgot all about that. Was just really kind of thinking, more in terms of just like the Martin Scorsese, master filmmaker. This is arguably maybe one of his most personal or passionate films that he's made. And so I was just totally picking it like on that alone,
Right.
Father, will you listen to me? Are you still there? Will you listen to a selfish, unfaithful son? I fought you when you called. I resisted. I thought I knew more. I didn't want to be your son. Can you forgive me? I didn't fight hard enough. Father, give me your hand. I want to bring salvation. Father, take me back. Make a feast. Welcome me home. I want to be your son. I want to pay the price. I want to be crucified and rise again. I want to be the Messiah.
Cullen, before we jump into the Last Temptation of Christ, and I'm really excited to do so, especially after that intense clip that we just listened to, I want to talk to our audience about Magic Mind. And we've talked about this product a few times in our previous episodes, but I want to bring it up again. I'm curious, Cullen. Are you a morning person?
No, not at all.
Seriously, you're not just saying that for the spot, right?
No, I like to think that I am. Like, there's something about getting up early in the morning that I do like. I like the idea of, and I always feel good once I'm like watching the sunrise or something like that. But I also am just not. I'm always tired, and I'm always I'm not a morning person.
I'm not a morning person either, and I can totally appreciate how you like the idea of it, and that you kind of wish you were, because I'm in the same boat. I'm right there with you. And I'm guessing that like you've probably, tried a bunch of different stuff to like get yourself going in the morning, right? And coffee, I don't know, energy drinks, like all this, whatever. Like, well, most people, I don't know what the the percentage of the population that has coffee is, but it's gotta be crazy high. Obviously, energy drinks are super popular. But there's another alternative out there that I've been trying for a while, and I wanted to share it with the audience. It's called Magic Mind. And there's a couple things that I really enjoy about this. First of all, I don't really like the taste of coffee. Not everybody does. I know it's like super popular. Not everybody does. And the cool thing is, if you do like coffee, you can actually take this Magic Mind alongside coffee. It's a little shot. It's a couple ounces. And it has 55 milligrams of caffeine in it. Now, that caffeine comes from matcha tea. And what's really cool about this is that it's actually kind of like a natural time-release caffeine. So first of all, a few things that I really enjoy about it. It's not, I don't like being overly caffeinated. I am not a fan of that. And I don't know about you. Maybe you love like huge amounts of caffeine. But I'm not a big fan. And I have actually found that it really hits like a nice sweet spot. Now, if you do like more caffeine, again, you could take this with coffee It's like a nice, like complementary kind of thing going on there. But I tend to prefer to just consume the shot myself, or I mean, all by itself. But 55 milligrams of caffeine, I found has like been the perfect amount to kind of like get me awake, kind of like break me through that like morning kind of, haze of kind of procrastination. And I kind of like just want to sit there and like watch YouTube videos for a while, It's actually kind of nice, kind of gets me motivated. But without like making me like kind of overly anxious or overly hyped up, which
and even if you were to take it with like a coffee too, there's other ingredients in it too that are beneficial, right? There's a whole bunch of different stuff that's in this drink that will add just or beyond just the caffeine.
That's a good point, Cullen. Thank you so. This is a reminder of why you are worth everything that you cost on the show, Cullen. This is a reminder, but it's true, and it's true. No, and look, and I harp on the Machete, right? Because I do love caffeine, even though I don't like too much of it, and I'm not a big fan of the taste of coffee. I do really focus on the caffeine aspect, but you are right. There are a lot of other ingredients in this that people might be interested in. Some examples: ashwagandha. There is like lion's mane mushrooms, cordyceps mushrooms. There's some other ingredients here. And of course, people could hop onto their website and check all these things out in more detail. So there definitely are more ingredients. You're absolutely right. I tend to kind of focus on the caffeine part. That's the part that I feel like my body seems to respond to the most. Now, I'm no expert. Who knows? Maybe I'm like feeling some of those other ingredients, but that tends to be kind of the thing that I focus on. Other people may be like more interested or sensitive to those other ingredients. It's true. But I can just tell you that for me, especially, one of the things that I'm trying to do is like get into the habit of writing, right? In the morning. I'm like working on developing my writing habit, making that stronger. And we've talked about that several times before in previous episodes. And man, for me, it's like so important, like that little ritual of like preparation, right? In getting ready to write. And I mean, I'm sure that people out there, whether it's writing or whatever it is that you kind of, have to prepare for in your day that's important to you, having like a little ritual around your preparation, I think can be extremely helpful. And I'd recommend giving Magic Mind a shot, no pun intended, to see if that could maybe be like a really effective part of your little ritual to get your day started or to prepare for whatever kind of creative endeavor you're working towards in your day. And thankfully, Magic Mind has some discounts that are going on right now, actually some pretty substantial discounts right now for the month of January, and especially for our listeners. So Cullen, tell them what they've won. Really, so just tell them what the discount is, but
Yes, yeah. If you go to the description and follow the link in the description, which is also magicmind.com/Jan Soldiers of Cinema. That's JAN, like January Soldiers of Cinema. Magic Mind sort of has like a triple whammy deal going on right now, which is that you are going to get a initial discount right off the top. If you use our code CINEMA20, that's CINEMA20, you're going to get an additional discount, an additional 20% off. Wow. And then if you subscribe for 3 months, so you can do individual purchases and you can do subscriptions, and if you do a subscription for 3 months, you actually are going to get a free month of subscription. So it's kind of like you just keep adding them up and you're golden. So definitely recommend checking that out. It's only on till the end of January, so time is running out. So if you are interested, hurry there. Again, link is in the description with our discount code as well. So I would highly recommend checking it out.
And that code is CINEMA20, as in 20, not the word, 20. But CINEMA20, CINEMA20. Awesome. Let's start with our personal experiences of the film. And I was, as always, I'm especially interested. I was 12 when the film was released. I didn't see it at the theaters. I wouldn't have been interested to see this at the theater, even if I was able to go. So I don't think honestly, I probably saw it before my first, like my memory of it. But my memory of it is having seen it on VHS in college. It's likely that I saw it before that. But my memory of it is maybe seeing it around 95, 96
Right.
Okay. But I'm really curious before I dive into that to hear about, as someone who's a total generation younger than me,
Mm-hmm.
like your first experience watching it.
Well, yeah,
And
this film came out almost exactly 10 years before I was born. I was born in July of 98, and this
I'm
is
so old.
August of 88.
So old.
There you go, yeah.
Or you're so young. I'm not so old. You're so young.
And well, I'm starting to feel, I pulled my back the other day, and I felt like an old man.
Oh, man. Yep.
But no, I grew up in a not very religious household at all. Didn't know much about Christianity or any religion for that matter, but definitely, I celebrated Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter and things like that, but more so as a cultural thing than
like a secular
one.
celebration. Yeah.
Never went to church as a kid and things like that. So
right.
So very much a secular household. Grew up without knowing much about it, to the point that I would have struggled to recount really any details about the story of like Jesus, about the Bible and things like that. I remember when I was in middle school or early high school, I can't remember which, I did read a large portion of the Bible, but I also read a large portion of the Quran because I was just very curious about those things. And
totally.
So I knew the sort of academic sense of the word of like theology and things like that, but again, never really got into the like cultural, spiritual level of it. And the first time I saw this movie, it really, it didn't.
Now, how old were you? What's the setting? What's the literal setting? I
remember. I was must have been the year after I graduated high school, if I can remember correctly. So
you're like 18, 19,
2016
20.
or 2017. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was the impetus? I'm curious. Like, why did you come to the movie? Why did you seek it out? It was.
I think I might have just been going through Scorsese's filmography. Honestly,
sure.
I think I don't know if I ever. I always saw it. Like, it has a very distinctive poster, and I always knew the movie, and I knew about the
poster is
controversy
fantastic,
and things like that.
by the way.
But it was also one of those ones where I was kind of like. Seems like an odd choice for Scorsese, because
really?
he's known as gangster flicks and things like that.
Yeah,
and it wasn't like I didn't, I knew that he had wanted to do the enter the priesthood as a kid and things like that, and so I was aware of his faith, but I always just like my assumption about the movie was that it was sort of like a biblical epic or like a Passion of the Christ, like it was a very religious,
or like the Ten Commandments with Charleston Heston or
never really. I was always kind of odd for him to, given his other filmography. And then I watched it, and again, it's not like it converted me, but what it did do was it made me much more curious to look into and much more connected, I think, to this story as like a level of how impactful it has been on the scale of like humanity than I've ever been before, and thinking about the way that this movie presents these usually very, very, again, when I say the word biblical, I mean like this epic story of like the Sermon on the Mount, or the
it's kind of hard to relate to, maybe. Like this,
and you're kind of like, you hear these things and it's like it sounds like a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Whereas this movie grounded it and really made these historical kind of moments much more palatable and relatable and grounded and accessible almost for someone who wasn't religious. I'm curious. Yeah, so I'm curious. A couple of things. When you first saw this film, you're maybe 19, 20 years old or so. I mean, were you aware of any of the controversy that was surrounding it on its release when you saw it? Okay, so you did kind of have an idea like, ooh, this film is a little controversial. It's been banned in some places. It was boycotted. It was a lot was kind of going on in this country and around the world when it was released. Did that impact at all? Like, it's actually funny because one of the reasons I knew about all that stuff was so one of the production companies, or I don't know if they financed it or if they just distributed it, but it's Cineplex Odeon, which is probably a name that like nobody knows outside of Canada, and also you've probably never seen it on any other movie. But Cineplex Odeon is a movie theater chain here. Okay, like Cineplex is basically our AMC in Canada. It's like the big theater chain.
Yeah,
and so it's always funny to me that like it would be like AMC theaters presents this movie.
Right.
And so that was one of the reasons, because I was always like, well, why did Cineplex, a Canadian movie theater chain, finance this Scorsese movie when he was very much a well-established director at that point? Like, it's not like he was scrounging around for
sure,
you know, a beginner filmmaker.
He had just released Color of Money a couple years earlier, but of course, you know, I mean, I love After Hours. I think that film's fantastic.
I love After Hours. Yeah.
King of Comedy is actually great too, but I don't think it was a huge commercial success. But Raging Bull, Taxi Drive, so I mean, he's an established director, and so you're like, oh, I'm curious. Like, this is weird.
and so I think that sort of made me look into it, and
it
also was like always kind of like a cultural conversation. Just I think most people who are like into movies and filmmaking and things like that just kind of hear about these stories about like controversial releases, and it's like
for
this,
sure.
And, you know.
Now you talked a lot about kind of, you know, how it maybe made some of these religious stories relatable, but do you have any recollections kind of just like taking the film just on its own, like just I
mean the style and the I remember the style and the score, I think, are the two things that stood out to me the most in terms of style, meaning like the way that they chose to present these characters as like with contemporary accents, with like speech patterns that weren't Shakespearean or classical or like theatrical, but rather, you know,
it's just street language.
Exactly, with like Harvey Keitel is speaking like Harvey Keitel, Dafoe is speaking like Dafoe. And I thought that was really fascinating to me, especially after having been through a quite intensive drama. I've mentioned this many times, but like my high school, I went to a high school for drama, and so I was doing theater every day for 4 years. And
you were like Fame. I just imagine you like that. Have you seen Fame?
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
Now the original. I don't know about this remake. I've not seen the remake, but I just imagine every time you say that, that's what I imagine, Cullen.
Yeah,
I imagine you like dancing, like you and your classmates like dancing down the stairwell and like jumping on the hoods of cars and
exactly.
I literally hear like,
well, specifically in 1982, we would go back.
Do you want to learn how to fly?
Just to do it. But no, it was, so I had been really exposed to, you know, a lot of theater and done a lot of theater. And I always found that, or at least when I first watched the movie, and I still think this, that it felt very, presented in a theatrical, like that choice itself feels to me like very much a choice that you would see in like a theatrical production of this show, where it's like, ooh, they're actually all speaking in their regular voices. Like that's what makes it interesting. I remember
like it was like Macbeth, performance art almost. Like it's almost like performative.
Well,
like it's
when I was there, we did Macbeth, and we set it in Afghanistan, and so it was like all about like PTSD and like we all had, you know, contemporary military, and so it was like that kind of thing.
That was what was in your mind.
You're kind of grounding this story in a modern way, and you know, I thought that was very fascinating. I thought it was really, you know, again, even just the scaled back element of production, where you don't have these grand sweeping epics with matte paintings, and you don't see like Jerusalem as this beautiful establishing shot of the world, and like you think of something like Gladiator or something like, you know, like
the
Robe
Sand and Sandal epics,
Ten Commandments, you know, and I thought that was also really, really interesting. And at the time, I don't think I realized quite the extent that Scorsese was just working within his means. I was assuming that these were, which, you know, partially they are active choices, but I didn't realize how much of this stuff he was kind of forced into. And, you know, we'll get into, I think, the details of that in a bit, because there's some really interesting specific events that I think make this movie really fantastic. But first, I want to hear about, you know, what your take was, and, you know, how you
Sure. Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, I don't know that I remember the first time I watched it, but the first time I do remember watching it was in college, and it actually, you know, a roommate that I was living with at the time, and again, I think I was like a junior or senior in college, and this is my first memory of it. And we rented the film on VHS. We watched it at home, and so it's like pan and scan, you know, 4:3 on a CRT TV. And you know, I remember, you know, I definitely heard about the controversies that existed around the film, and unlike you, I had grown up in a household where I was attending church uh, because of because of my mother, like 3 times a week. So it's like twice
Wow.
on Sunday and once on Wednesday. Now, not Catholic, so different denomination or different kind of sect than Scorsese was coming from as a Roman Catholic. And I don't want to speak for him or erroneously represent this. I'm not sure if he's practicing or what his faith or belief is, but I think he was raised in that as a Roman Catholic. But for me, I was raised Protestant, and so some differences there. But I'm not a religious scholar, so I couldn't articulate all those differences to anyone. But yeah, so a little bit of a difference, that I was raised attending to church, and so I was kind of really curious to see, because I had heard of that controversy, to see what it was all about. And honestly, it was almost more of like I'm really curious to see how this biblical story and the story of Jesus is going to be represented in this film. So I was kind of, rebelling a little bit against that religious upbringing myself. So I was like, ooh, this is interesting, right? But I remember feeling like really quite blown away by the film, honestly. I was really, it was, and I think similar to what you were saying, that it made a lot of ideas that are represented or maybe hinted at, or it made a lot of ideas kind of come alive to me in kind of accentuating the human aspect of Jesus in this story and the intimate. You talk about the scale of this film being so small, and it really is. I mean, it's it's shot in, I think, like 185 or 178 instead of some 235 or 239. There's almost no huge establishing landscape shots. Everything is very tight. It's like mediums. I mean, it's almost, I'd call it like shot for TV almost,
Well, kind of like in a Psycho way, where it's like the means were available and that's what they used.
That's what they did. But I think it works. I mean, but honestly, I think if they had the money, if they would have gone bigger, it would have done a disservice to the film. Because that's what this film is an intimate human portrait. Now, I don't want to get into kind of a discussion of, is this, blasphemy, or is this appropriate or anything like that. I think Scorsese has the right as an artist for his voice, for him to speak through his film, and people have the right to watch it or don't watch it, or agree or don't agree. But I really appreciated his take on it personally, and to really almost kind of make it more of a story about a man trying to transcend his inherent, flawed humanity, right?
Yeah.
And the struggle that I think we all, or most of us have, unless I guess you're a psychopath, to try to be good human beings in life, in spite of our inherent flaws and shortcomings. So that really spoke to me. And I was really impressed with that. I thought Willem Dafoe's performance was outstanding. I remember very specifically being really impressed with that. And some of these things are done so simply but impactful. I mean, I still remember watching the film and the scene where Jesus is out in the desert and he's drawn the circle around himself in the sand, and he's fasting out there alone. And he has the serpent come to him, and the lion come to him, and the pillar of flame come to him. How simply done that all is. I mean, it's so simply done. It's just it's just an image of an animal and a voiceover.
Yeah.
But I was like, wow, this is so beautiful. So I was really struck by that. And I think in the end, where we have this, as Jesus is up on the cross and he's visited by this young girl who tries, or I guess it's the Satan represented as a young girl, if I'm not mistaken, who tries to tempt him to come down off the cross. And we have this whole little section here now where it's like you kind of think it's going to be the end. He's on the cross, right? He's dying. And then we have this whole little dreamlike moment where he's living his life as a human.
Well, it's the last temptation, right?
It's the last temptation. Yeah. Yes. And it's but it was just, and I just felt like that was so beautiful. I thought that was really beautifully done. So I was really impressed by the film. I enjoyed it, and it made me think. Now, I don't think I've actually seen it though. since then until now.
Wow.
So,
wow.
yeah, I don't think I've even owned it. I watched the Criterion Collection. I've got the Blu-ray, and I've had it for years. And this is the first time I've actually cracked it open out of the library and popped it in and watched it.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously there was something inside of me that was like, I want to revisit this and I want to talk about it for this episode. So there you have it.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, like I want to kind of talk about scale too, just real quick. We've touched on it a few times, but I mean, even the fact that they couldn't afford a crane for the film.
Right.
So they just had a jib. I think it's like they could go 8 feet up.
Yeah.
Which
7 or 8 feet.
Which is not, like that's for people who perhaps aren't familiar with like what these things are. Like a jib is basically just a little arm that you put on a tripod, and like I have an 8-foot jib. Like that's how low budget this is in terms of. I mean, of course they had $7 million, but the vast majority of that money would have gone to locations and actors,
feeding and
like
housing,
that, right?
cast and crew. Yeah, I mean, it was shot in Morocco, $7 million. Even in '88, this is almost nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah, tiny budget, but again, I think it actually really helps the film.
Well, and I think one of the moments that I wanted to point out specifically that I think really encapsulates why that works so well is the Sermon on the Mount, which even as someone who's not religious, wasn't raised religious, who didn't really know the full story, you hear about that and you kind of, it's told to you in this grand way where oh my God, there was crowds of people listening to Jesus, preach his first time. And
well, there's a reason why you use the word biblical to describe something as huge.
Exactly. and it becomes this very untouchable, kind of inaccessible story.
Totally.
Whereas I remember there's a point in the commentary for this where Scorsese talks about the fact that he was kind of like not embarrassed, but like almost ashamed to be doing this movie at such a low level, because he was like, this isn't the Sermon on the Mount. This is like there's like 12 people here.
There's like 12 people here.
What is this? And then Michael Ballhaus, the cinematographer, who I think does brilliant work throughout this movie, said to Scorsese, he's like, well, this is probably what it was like. It probably was like 12 people who just by word of mouth passed on. And over 2,000 years, obviously this story is going to take on a new life and take on grand elements that probably weren't really accurate to the time. And I find that kind of is the essence of the film to me. Like, it's like you think about Dafoe as Jesus Christ, it's like arguably the most well-known name in human history.
At least in Western culture.
At least, definitely in Western culture. And yet you've got him portraying this character not as, we've seen plenty of films that try to humanize Jesus in a way where it's like, oh, he's a flawed guy, and then he rises above that and becomes the Messiah. But this movie never really does that. There is clear conflict in that character. Throughout the entire time, which I think, again, probably was quite accurate to the real historical figure that Jesus was, that you've got this person who dances, who drinks, who is not a party animal, but is a man of the times and of the circumstance that he's in and what he existed in. And I think to remove the religious figure from that, as so many movies do, and to put that person on a pedestal kind of defeats what I think the purpose of that story is ultimately, which is that we are all, that's supposed to be a representation of humanity. And I think that if you remove that, you kind of lose that. Whereas I think Scorsese did a brilliant job of taking what he clearly believes very strongly in, as a Roman Catholic, and he talks about that as that, his main goal for making the film. Also, he describes it as wanting to get to know Jesus better, which I think is interesting.
Well, I think that's the key. That's the key.
Yeah, and it's like, and I think that is exactly what he's done. Is he's humanized this character and grounded him and made it something that you can relate to and experience alongside these stories that we've all heard, but we've never really taken into account, like what would it have been like from an accurate historical perspective.
Well, and I would disagree with you a little bit on this accurate historical thing. In other words, maybe disagree is a strong word. I would say it doesn't matter.
Yes,
because I don't think that's what's happening here. This is not a documentary. We're not trying to understand what happened in real life, because
it's not a Ken Burns.
There's no way to know what, in my estimation. Again, it's like, I'm not Scorsese, I'm not speaking for him, but the sense that I get through watching the film, through experiencing his work, and through hearing some of the things he said about it is, and you actually nailed this, is that, when he asked when he was asked why did he want to make the film, he said, because I wanted to get to know Jesus better. I think what's happening here is what I love about good cinema. And that is this. I think one of the big differences between really great art and mediocre art, or even propaganda or didactic works that masquerade as art, is this. And that is that the artist is asking questions that they don't already know the answer to in good art.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening here. I think you see someone who is earnest, who is honest, who is genuine, who is by no means trying to offend or criticize, but he's trying to understand. He's asking questions and exploring ideas about something that's deeply important to him, that's deeply personal to him. And this is an exploration, and he doesn't know the answers. And that, I think, this is a really great example of that. And we see a lot of films where from the get-go that the creators of that film, the prime creative movers, the director, the writer, they knew exactly what they wanted to go from the very beginning. Like, I have this to say about this, and I'm going to show you should think that way too. I can't stand that kind of work. It's nauseating to me. Which isn't to say that they didn't have a script and they didn't know the story that they wanted to tell.
Yeah, or even that they didn't have a point of view.
Right. And it's not to say they didn't have a point of view, but it's to say, we're here to ask questions. This is an exploration. The process of the creation of this film is an exploration, and we're just asking questions, and we want you to go along with, and maybe you have these questions too. Maybe you've wondered this too. And so, that's, to me, this is a really wonderful example of that through cinema. It would be something I would strive for in my work, ideally, whatever the subject matter, is a goal of mine. So that, I think, is that's my take on what's happening here. And obviously that was offensive to some people at the time, and probably still to this day, because they're coming at it from a perspective of, this is taboo. You should not be asking these questions.
Yeah.
I disagree with that in every possible way. I think that you should always be able to ask questions, and I think that an artist always has the right to express their voice. You may decide not to listen to it, or attend it, or pay money to see it, or support it, or whatever. But so I feel pretty strongly about that.
Well, I do. I want to go on a tangent real quick too, that is directly related to what you just said about asking questions, things like that. And I think, so I want to talk more about the actors' voices and why they chose. So, but before we do that, before we get into that, I want to just briefly say that the reason that they keep citing in the commentary, and Schrader talks about this a lot, and Scorsese talks about it a lot, is that, like, it's not so when these characters are having these arguments on screen, when Judas and Jesus are having a fight about what is it that they're trying to do, that they're speaking in contemporary accents and contemporary language. They're not saying thee, thou, whatever. Yeah, they're speaking in contemporary, because that is how it would have sounded at the time to somebody who spoke those languages. And they keep talking about this idea that it's not that you're watching it on screen, it's that you're sitting in an audience and these characters are sitting beside you, arguing with you. They're having these conversations with you in a language that you can understand, in a vernacular that you can understand. And I felt very vindicated hearing that, because, like you said, like you replicating that kind of thing in your work. Like the second narrative feature film that I've been writing is something that really I've had a lot of struggle with. It's really been a challenge to get it on paper and to figure out, like, what is it that I want to say with it. And I'm not going to go into detail about what it's about and things like that, but one of the reasons for that is because it can kind of be a little bit frightening to think that, well, I want to put something controversial on the page and on the screen, but not for the sake of controversy. Right. It's controversial on its own,
because it's hard.
As another thing,
difficult.
because it's the taboo conversation that you want to have, and it's kind of tough to pitch. I've been talking to producers and things like that, and production companies, and it's kind of tough to pitch something as this isn't. There is no master thesis here. I want to have a conversation with the audience. I want the audience to come out of this movie questioning things about themselves, and not in a way that's just controversial or evocative for like the own sake of being controversial, because I think that's kind of boring. At that point you're just basically trolling, essentially.
Sure. Yeah, essentially.
But rather,
yes. Correct.
Rather to actually get people to kind of think about like the choices that they've made, how they live their lives, things like that. And that's a really tough thing to do.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a frightening thing to do, because you never know how people are going to react to being challenged like that. And so I think that being able to hear Scorsese and Schrader talk about the way that they went about this film and the reason they made those choices, and yet being able to see a movie like this that where it works so well and it works so perfectly and profoundly, that in a way sort of vindicated me and really has made me, as someone who not only watches films and loves watching films, but also makes them, much more confident about those choices, that I can make those choices, that I can do that I can put into words how I want an audience to react and what I'm actually aiming for and the questions I want to ask, rather than, like you said, coming at it with a found solution that I'm going to be imprinting on people. And I think that is a much more interesting way to, and I think that honestly, like I it's not good that Scorsese had to walk around with bodyguards for years after this, but at the same time, I think that is also, that proves how much meaning and power art has, right? That it that it caused this controversy, that it started these conversations, that you have this, the largest religion in the world, 2,000 years old, these stories that penetrate each and every aspect.
Well, it might not be the
Western
largest.
life.
It might not be the largest religion in the world. Not that it matters to your conversation, but I'm not quite sure. But there may be other religions that technically are larger than Christianity. But I'm not an expert.
It is still the like, by numbers. I think it still is. I think it's getting close. It's almost neck and neck between Islam and Christianity at this point. But
what? I stand corrected, Cullen. I'm so sorry. And I stand corrected. Not that this is a podcast about religion, but I think that, at least according to 2020 Pew Research review, I think you're right. I think that Christianity is the largest religion in the world. So I stand corrected.
And so
you're
so
right. You're right.
That's what I mean, though, is that it's like you've got to be able to ask these questions. And I think that also it's not just a matter, I think, like, I don't want to come off as someone who's saying that, like, the religious people that reacted that way are like bad, and they don't, because I'm sure that there are a lot of religious scholars, that there are a lot of people who are deeply religious who find this film very fascinating and find film as something that's like really, really, I think that the most interesting aspects of religion are the ones that kind of turn inward in a way.
I want to mention something here. I want to talk about, because I think this is like a great point to interject this. So when I was a kid, I used to love watching. I watched Siskel and Ebert. They used to have these are if you're younger. I mean, I know you know who they are, but if you're younger, Siskel and Ebert were two critics that used to have a TV show where they would, and this is my first exposure to film criticism when I was a kid, was Siskel and Ebert on TV. I think it was was it Siskel and Ebert at the Movies, I think was the name of their show?
Yes.
I'm probably going to get this wrong. Okay.
I think that was it, yeah.
And so this was actually before, because what am I, 8, 9 years old? I'm not reading, I'm not reading like reviews in, the Atlantic or something back then, right? Yeah. So this was my first exposure, but I think this speaks to kind of what you were just talking about. So I want to kind of read a little bit of an excerpt of their thoughts at the time in '88 about this film. And just as a little more background, not that it really matters, but just for funsies, I tended to always I tended to agree much more with Ebert than I did with Siskel. And they often, clashed hugely on the movies they liked and didn't like. On this film, they're both in agreement. They both liked the film quite a bit. But I want to just read a little excerpt from what Ebert had to say about this film. He said back in '88 on the show, "This movie made me think more deeply and more seriously and for a longer time. I mean, I'm still thinking about it, about the mystery of the fact that Jesus was both God and man. At least within the Christian teachings, that's what he was. More than any other film I have ever seen, or at any other time in my life, did I really confront that he was God and he was man. He had all the weaknesses of man as well as all the strengths of God. This movie is a devout movie that does Jesus the compliment of taking him more seriously than any other movie ever made. So it's an ironic contradiction that people who worship Jesus and who haven't seen the film are attacking this film, which is actually more of a religious experience than any other movie."
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah,
that's a pretty powerful statement about a film.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, that's Ebert and Siskel had pretty similar thoughts too at the time. But it also, I feel like it almost speaks a little bit to our experience, right? I mean, we may not be practicing Christians or have different beliefs, or maybe we have the same beliefs. I don't want to assume anything for you,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like this film, more than any I've seen, it does something to convey this fundamental aspect of the duality of humanity, of our need to strive for an ideal, of being better. And so,
you know what I think it does, that I think one of the really key aspects to that is Schrader's approach to it. Now, again, one of the interesting factors about this is that,
well, let's give a little background.
The author of the book, God, I'm going to butcher.
It's okay. Do your best.
I've got to read it. I can't. Okay, so Nikos Kazantzakis. I'm gonna guess
he wrote the book, right?
So he wrote the book, and he's a Greek Orthodox
in 55, actually.
Yeah.
So the novel had been around for a long time. It was written in 55, and
then Schrader is Dutch Calvinist,
and he wrote the script,
and he wrote the screenplay, the initial kind of screenplay, which was later adjusted by Scorsese and I can't remember. I'm blanking all over the place.
It's okay. We'll dig it up later.
And so you've got Schrader, and then you've got Scorsese, who's a Roman Catholic, right? So you've got these three different interpretations of this story. And I find that Schrader's interpretation fascinates me a lot, because Schrader looks at this story not as an insider, but almost as an outsider, despite the fact that he's Dutch Calvinist. Looks at it like, and he specifically says, I wanted to treat, not in a like demeaning way, but I wanted to treat Christianity kind of as like, I'm looking at this blood cult, because that's ultimately, a direct quote from him is that it's a blood cult where the blood is still drank weekly, but you don't have to kill for it. But ultimately, you're drinking the wine that is representative of the blood of Christ.
Right.
Like that would be considered by, if we were to take an anthropological look at history, that's what that is technically. And so when you look at it that way, when you remove the kind of veneer of like a personal bias or affiliation, and you can actually look at these things and kind of put them in the context of what they are and what they were at the time, I find that deeply, deeply fascinating, because then what you can do is you can explore the kind of foundations of what we know Christianity to be and what we know this story to be, rather than having to worry about representing something that is, you're still representing something that obviously is very meaningful to Scorsese. And he's very clear about that. But at the same time, you're able to kind of look at it. You're almost able to like take yourself out of the box and look at it from the outside and analyze it and see, treat these as characters and look at their motivations and understand them as people. You understand, again, like the moment that I think is just brilliant is the very small scene with Bowie, where Bowie plays Pontius Pilate. Pilate is always kind of represented in these stories as like this big bad guy who like when is trying Jesus, there's, you know, often it's represented as like almost like a court trial where people are watching and people are like, but in reality the likelihood that was the case is very small. And again, like you said earlier, it's not just about accuracy. That's not what this is about at all.
Yeah, I don't
it's
think this film
accuracy.
this film has no this film is not trying to approach
but rather
any of these,
when you look at it that way, you just get a much more human story. That Pilate probably didn't much, like, he wasn't offended by Jesus' presence. He probably didn't really much care. He was probably just a governor of a land and was looking at someone who was a political criminal, essentially, and going, well, like, I mean, this is the offense that you've committed, and this is the punishment for it, right? Like, and I think that is such an incredibly, you know, unique, but also, like Ebert said, like, that brings you to it does Jesus the compliment of taking him seriously, right? Like, of not representing him as this idyllic messiah, but rather as a political criminal, you know, like as almost like a revolutionary in a way, like that. And I find that's really, really a fascinating way to go about it, that you're not looking at it again with the veneer of, it's because I wouldn't really describe this as like it's not like a Christian movie, right? Like, it's not like a faith movie that you see today. It takes itself incredibly seriously. It takes the subject matter very earnestly, and very authentically. And I think that's its strength, is that it's not purporting anything. It's just exploring.
And I, if I will, I mean, I think, like, maybe what you're describing, I want to see if this resonates with you, because you're talking about like this authenticity almost, and you're, you know, but I think it's an emotional authenticity.
Yes.
I think it's it is authentic emotionally to our human experience that exists in all of us, right? And this, I think, is what the film's goal is and what it's trying to achieve. So this idea of, was this historical person like this, or was this historical person like that, I think it doesn't have any meaning.
It doesn't matter
to me and my interpretation of this. And again, this film wasn't like, it doesn't even pretend to be like trying to be written from the Bible directly or anything like that. It wasn't. It's written from a book that just happens to be exploring Jesus as a story, okay, as a character, and using that as a way to try to ask questions about the human condition, is my interpretation.
No, I agree with that 100%. Yeah.
And so I think that's what, right, there's an authenticity of emotion that this film elicits that doesn't exist in a lot of these huge biblical epics, where we're seeing things from a distance and characters are not very relatable, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one of the big successes of this film, is that it is emotionally authentic, and it speaks to like a really primal, foundational part of what it means to be human. I think that's huge. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other, you know, some of the I don't know, technical, but just like, you know, as a film. I mean, we talked a little bit about performances. We talked a little bit about Willem Dafoe. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult of a performance this must have been to give. You know, like, I mean, wow, you know, there's a lot on your shoulders here. Just, you know, even just logistically, I mean, to hear him describe what it was like to be on the cross and to have to film that.
Oh my God, miserable. That seems hellish.
Oh my goodness. I mean, it's just a very vulnerable performance. And really wonderful. And, you know, it's just crazy because I hadn't seen the film in so long. You know, in my mind now, I kind of have like the Green Goblin kind of Willem Dafoe in my head, right? You know, sadly, because of the memes and everything. But I had forgotten that he had given such a wonderful performance in this film back then. It was really amazing. But, you know, some fun stuff. It's interesting to note that Harvey Keitel, who I love, was actually nominated for a Razzie for his role, and I think as Judas. And it's my understanding the reason was probably because of the language thing that you had discussed earlier, where Paul and Scorsese and Martin had decided to use street language, like modern, current, contemporary language, and even so much including like Harvey's accent. You know, it's almost sounds like he came out of mean streets and he's just here with like a perm and dyed hair, dyed hair, and he's in sandals and a robe, and he's like, but he, just pulled from the streets of New York almost. And so I can understand a little bit why, maybe there would have been some hesitancy to kind of accept that. But I think he didn't win the Razzie. I think it totally was BS that he was even nominated for one, because I think he's actually quite good here. But I had forgotten, or just totally missed. So I was super happy to see Harry Dean Stanton's face. I absolutely adore Harry Dean Stanton. There's just something about him that seems so comfortable and human and vulnerable in his face and in his performances. I don't know if it's like this kind of, I don't know what it is. There's like a softness to him. That is always really beautiful. David Bowie, I didn't remember at all that David Bowie was
me neither, yeah.
as Pontus. I was just like, wait a minute, what? That's David Bowie. It's my understanding that was originally going to be Sting. For whatever reason, that casting had to change. So David Bowie flew in for a day or two and shot this. But I was pretty surprised to see that. I had totally forgotten that. But it's just some interesting performances, interesting people pop up.
I think
Barbara
one
Hershey,
of the things that
we didn't talk about. She's great.
Dafoe mentioned something that's really curious to me, which is about the idea that because he's in every scene in the movie, and he sort of talks about like the benefit of being, it seems like it might be a lot to take, but in fact, his description of it was like, well, it's actually a lot easier to be in every scene in the movie, because then you don't have to be, you don't have to worry that like every moment is going to hit or not, because people are ultimately going to look at the whole movie and pull out the best moments and think about those. Whereas if you only have, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of screen time or one scene or something, you've got to really nail that one scene, because that's all people are going to remember of you. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but I mean, there's a great cast of characters. Again, the like they talk about how they specifically cast the disciples, that I think they're primarily like American and Canadian, and then and that the reason for that was that they wanted it to feel like you could walk into a bar and have a conversation with these people, and that they would be having these conversations, which again is like really fascinating. I can understand sort of the reaction to a general audience of sort of saying like, well, this is kind of weird, like why are they talking like this? But I think it really works on a whole. Like I can get the confusion, but I think once you buy into it, it absolutely,
it didn't bother me at all. It didn't.
No, it didn't.
Honestly, it didn't
bother me either. But I understand why people would sort of say like, well,
sure,
why is he speaking in a New York accent if they're in Judea?
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's because my exposure to those like more traditional biblical epics is pretty much non-existent. I mean, I really don't have a history of having seen a lot of that. So I think I come into this and I'm like, okay, cool. I'm open. Yeah. I'm right on. No problem at all for me.
And I want to also briefly want to touch on too, because I last summer went all over Morocco. I went all over a bunch of different places, but I drove like the entire country. So one thing that's really
amazing,
incredible to me about watching this is that I think like I want to say 90% of the locations in this film I went to, not even intentionally. I just saw so much of the country, but I think that one part that is really neat is that they talk about how outside of Meknes it almost is alpine, like there's like these huge trees, and that's where they film the sequence of the last temptation of him in that wooded
where
house.
It gets so green.
And Morocco is such a fascinating place because you can drive for 20 minutes and you can be in the Sahara Desert in 1 second, and then 50 kilometers away suddenly you're in a place that looks like the California redwoods, and it's a really deeply like geographically interesting country. And not only that, but I think that also, that probably explains why this and so many films have been shot there. But there's also such incredible, architecture from thousands of years ago. There's one place called Ait Benadou, which is where they shot a lot of like the market scenes and
well, we
like
don't get to see a lot of that in this film,
anything that basically
you know?
requires kind of like an old city. I know they shot a lot of like Game of Thrones and Gladiator and Lawrence of Arabia there as well. And there's just some really, really beautiful, like I actually, not to get off on, you know, some random stream of thought, but when I was there, it was like sundown, and so there was nobody in this entire like hill of these ancient houses and huts and mud, you know, structures. And so I was literally just walking the streets of this place like completely alone. It was really, really incredible. Like it felt like
so since you've been there, I want to ask, okay, since you've been there and you talk about this architecture, this ancient architecture is beautiful. I mean, we see almost none of that in this film.
Yeah, it's used very sparingly. I mean, that's the thing, is like it and I don't know if that could have been I suppose a lot of this story as well takes place out in the desert, and that's kind of the idea, is isolation and
I mean, we see adobe walls, and that's about it.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't even hardly see a building. It's in its
well, even like
entirety.
Jerusalem is just really the temple. Like that's really all that's there.
And just these tight interiors. I mean, we have no idea of scope or scale.
Yeah.
We have
and so I think that it's fascinating choice wise. I think again it was likely a matter of you know, they talk about how they just didn't have the money to shoot like establishing shots. They didn't have the money to shoot these like sweeping vistas of sites. And I think that, again, that also makes it a lot more approachable and grounded, because you've got this element of like these locations wouldn't have been special to these characters, right? They wouldn't have been anything but cities, you know.
I think it would have, as we discussed, I mean, I think it would have taken the focus away from the intimacy it would have definitely changed that level of intimacy, which I think is so vital for the story that they're telling here, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think, and it's the exact reason, you know, the vice versa in these epics is that they are trying to show grandeur. They are trying to show the divine.
And you lose sort of the human element when you do that.
You lose right. And so I think that's exactly what they said that the goal was here, to accentuate the human. And and I think, you know, had they had 2x, 3x, 4x the budget, if anything, it might have tempted them to do things that might have actually distracted from that.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. Yeah.
So something we hadn't touched on here, but I want to, as sometimes sadly we give this like a little, you know, we don't give it as much time maybe as we should, which is by no means to say that it isn't a vital part of the film, and that's the score.
Yeah.
And Peter Gabriel does the score here for this film, and I am fascinated by it. I am especially a fan of Peter Gabriel's work at about this time, and I think it works so wonderfully here. You talk about, you know, kind of contemporary language in an ancient story, and I think here you have kind of the mirroring of that with these like traditional older instrumentation with modern rhythmic or melodic application. Is, I think, super effective. It's like, I mean, it's surreal in places. It's like, it's just really ephemeral in places. It's compelling and driving in other places. I feel like it's a really extremely effective score. I was curious, like, what were your thoughts? Like, what's your impression on that? I
love it. I mean, I think that it's also really like a brave choice to not use something classical in this kind of context, and it's very new age. I like Peter Gabriel a lot. Period. I find that just it's one of these things in filmmaking that I really, really like, when a director, you know, uses music perhaps that's more appropriate to the emotion of the moment rather than the setting. I remember I was like made fun of because I made a movie in grade 11 or something, a short film, and it was set in the 60s. It was like Andy Warhol and the Factory Girls and things like that. And then I remember I ended the film with a Phil Collins song. And I was like, it really
Which one?
I think song? It was In the Air Tonight. It was In the Air Tonight.
Oh, nice.
And it just Great really song. Hit, and it worked for the moment, and it worked for the
now,
mood, and everyone was like,
did you get that cleared? Did you have
No,
rights
it was just for a student film festival, so I had to pay. Yes, I paid $10,000 for the.
Okay, all right.
But good. And I found it really interesting because I remember a lot of people said to me, they were like, well, why'd you use that? That's not a 60s song. Like, that's not the point. I don't really care.
My gosh.
But then I think that's something that a lot of people probably thought at the time too about this, where it's like, hang on, why are there like,
maybe not too much, because I think, there is definitely the flavor, right? There's the instrumentation.
Oh, yes. He uses a lot of like geographic kind of,
it's and it's just to put in some time too, or to kind of put it in context of time. I mean, got to remember, like back in the late 80s, I mean, Peter Gabriel was one of the biggest musical artists around. I mean, this is like the era of, Sledgehammer, huge hits, big on MTV.
Yeah, I guess when did Genesis break up?
Boy, now
like
you've asked me a question I don't know the answer to. I'm not. I think. I don't know. I'm not quite sure, but I do know that his solo career was really starting to take off around like 85 or so.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I'm not quite sure. But his career really started to get big. I mean, it had to have been even earlier, right? Because in 82, didn't he have the hit "Shock the Monkey"? Because that was one of the first big hits in the US.
Yeah.
And that was in 82. So I don't know if he was still working. I don't know if he was still.
Yeah. So for the better part of a decade, he'd been establishing himself as a
because so he had let. Okay, yeah. So I'm definitely wrong person to ask about the history of Genesis, for sure. But I mean, he was really a huge artist at the time. So to lend his weight to this, but it was like really in line with a lot of the things he was exploring at the time. With the instrumentation and world music and things like this, and the rhythms he was exploring. So it's a really interesting match here. And
it works really well. That moment when they kind of do the riot at the temple. And I can't remember what I'm not gonna remember what the name of the song in the soundtrack is, but the music there as they approach is so. There's just so many like layers to it. It's really, really, it's like part New Age, but it's also using a lot of like,
it's world music,
Middle Eastern, Arabian kind of instrumentation with like really interesting vocalization that Gabriel did himself with a few other, singers. So it's a really incredible blend. Like it's a great soundtrack on its own just to listen to. Which I'm huge on movie soundtracks, so I'm always surprised that we don't spend more time. I think it's mostly just because I don't know much about music as a like technical topic.
That's
so
fair.
I'm always kind of hesitant to get into it. But I love like soundtracks are a big kind of side hobby of mine. I listen to a lot of them and have my favorites and things like that. So no, I think that this is. Again, it would be so easy to kind of fall into just doing something that's sort of classical or just doing something that's like stereotypically, Middle Eastern sounding and kind of, and just doing it that way. But rather, I think it kind of is sort of like almost like a transcendent, almost psychedelic score in a lot ways.
Which
I kind of makes sense because I also think that
it's kind of a psychedelic movie in some ways,
that's what I was going to say too, is that like Schrader's whole idea of like communicating with God probably was a huge headache, and that was like the first idea that he had.
Right, it's like a migraine.
And that's how it opens. I mean, it opens with him having a terrible headache, and then going from that to, even the hallucinations in the desert, that Scorsese has a really interesting comment about that, where it's like, after spending 40 days not eating or not drinking in the desert,
you're going to see some stuff.
The lion that walks by is probably going to talk to you.
Yeah.
So it's really, it really is kind of like, there's a lot of psychedelia, which I think is a really fascinating and also very introspective kind of way to look at these stories. And I think that that's very, very fascinating, something that I love about it. And I think that that's another reason the score works super well. It's because it really embraces all that stuff. Now, I don't know what the conversations Gabriel and Scorsese had about, like, if Scorsese gave him direction on that, or if Gabriel saw it and just took it on his own.
Who knows?
But works really well.
Well, maybe we can get them. Maybe that'll be a goal. Maybe we can get them both on the podcast. What do you think? Like, what are the odds?
Well, hey, I know I am one league of separation from Scorsese, so maybe I can.
All right, get on it. Get on it. Hey, I have a hunch that we might increase our reach, our audience, if we got
just
Scorsese.
A little bit. Just a
little bit. Hey, we can have dreams, right? We can hope, we can dream.
Mm-hmm.
And on that note, I mean, this has been awesome. I really picked this film honestly on a whim, Cullen. It was really, I kind of was just like, I keep my entire library of physical media on an app on my phone, and I was kind of scrolling through it. I'm like, well, what have I not seen in a while that I would, like to revisit, or maybe hell, I haven't seen it all, and I want to watch for the first time. And this just popped up, and it was just a total gut reaction of like, I haven't seen this in 20 plus years. I want to do this. And so, as always, I'm like really, it makes me happy to have such a like fulfilling conversation about it. I'm glad you enjoyed it too.
No, I'm really glad that you chose this, because it wasn't even on my like radar.
Yeah. And not that you have to enjoy it. Like, I want to be perfectly clear. It's funny because I had one of my wife's friends was talking to her at work, and she was like, hey, I want you to know, like, I listened to your husband's podcast. I really enjoy it. But they were like, but it's kind of funny because every time and he wasn't criticizing us. He thought it was cute. But he was like, but every single episode, every new episode, it's like, oh, that's their new favorite movie, It's like, oh no, this is my favorite. Well,
just wait till he listens to the La La Land one.
Yeah. No. It's like, oh no, this is my favorite movie. Oh no, this is my favorite
that's
movie.
Hilarious.
And okay, and I will agree. I'll admit that it's true that we haven't really, covered movies that we dislike, right? Because. Which isn't to say that you can't learn a lot from movies that you dislike. Oh my gosh, you absolutely can. I mean, there are things that you can learn from poorly executed films, from films that miss their mark.
I've got some ideas for my next one.
Yeah, or films that you just don't connect to. It doesn't even have to be a film that's not a good film for you not to connect to it. So there's a lot of, you can absolutely learn a lot from that. But I think a person could understand, listening to this podcast, why we might be more inclined to pick films that are interesting to us, at the very least, if not flat out enjoyed by us, because of course that's going to compel a more interesting conversation from us. But who knows, maybe someday one of us will pick a film that the other person just full on, flat out, absolutely despises, and that's going to be an interesting
or maybe one that we both don't like,
or maybe one that we both I mean, look,
I have an idea in my head. I'm not going to spoil it, but
I guess part of it is that, like, I think both of us are kind of like generally we're polite, kind of nice people, and as filmmakers ourselves, it's like the last thing I ever want to do is like poop on somebody's hard work. I mean, I know how hard it is to make a film. You know how hard it is to make a film. Literally, just to complete a film. Forget is it good, is it bad, is it this, is it that. Just to complete
the logistics behind it.
90 to 120 hours of moving pictures connected with audio and soundtrack. Like, just to get that done and have, like, here's a movie, requires usually years of ass-busting work by many, many, many people.
Yeah.
It's no joke. So I tend to never think of films as like, oh, this is just garbage, I'm going to crap on it for the sake of just being mean, because I know how much blood, sweat, and tears have gone into it. But maybe someday we'll do a film where we're kind of like, wow, this just didn't connect to us, and here's why.
On that note too, I think if we did that, it would be an exploration of like an interrogation of what we don't like about it, much more than just us crapping on a
Here's
movie.
Where, that's just not our style. You're probably not going to get that from us if that's what you're interested in. I'm sure there are many other podcasts where they take the piss out of films just for fun, but that's not going to be us. Anyway, all right, everybody. Cullen, it was a pleasure. I can't wait to hear your choice for next time. And everybody out there who's listened, as always, we hope you enjoy the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Everybody, take care. Have a good couple weeks.
Yeah, bye-bye.